Welcome to First Reading, the Old Testament lectionary podcast for lovers of the Hebrew Bible everywhere. My name is Rosy. I am an assistant professor in biblical studies at Wake Forest University, and I'm here joining you for a series called the Summer Shorts on the 9th week after Pentecost, Ordinary Time. And our thematic readings are the ones that we will be pursuing this summer. Our first reading is taken from Genesis chapter 15, 1 through 6. A famous passage involving Abraham in which a covenant is made with this patriarch of faith, and in which Abraham exhibits some doubt, right? So the beginning of the passage starts out with, "Do not be afraid, Abraham," or Abram, rather. This is before his name is changed. "I am your shield, your reward shall be very great." Abram's response is to say, but what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. What Abram is expressing is doubt, because at this point in his life, he is aging and he has no child, right? So that's what he's saying to God. How will you make this promise known to me? In this passage in Genesis 15, God then takes him out into this beautiful scene where he's asked to look up at the stars and see if he can number them. Obviously, he can't. And what God says to him is, you see these stars and that you can't number them, so shall your descendants be. And Abraham seems to believe that, takes that to heart. But one of the things that I want to point out for this week's reading is a theme that is moving through these passages, and I'm going to suggest that that theme is faith. And in fact, this phrase, "do not be afraid," is what begins our gospel passages from this week, Luke chapter 12, verses 32 to 40. And in that passage, that famous passage, this is in the Lucan passage where Jesus says, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." And the counsel in this passage from Luke is that Jesus is saying, be ready, for you do not know the day or the hour. Have faith. And put your faith in what outlasts material possessions, right? So the wisdom of the world is to put your faith in gaining wealth and status and position and all these things. And in chapter 12, verses 32 to 40, our reading for this week, Jesus repositions, reorients his listeners toward what really matters, right? And so all of our passages, our second passage then, Psalm chapter 33, verses 12 to 22, and Hebrew chapter 11, verses 1 through 3, it skips then to verses 8 through 16. And Hebrews 11 kind of puts this theme of faith, like kind of underlines that, right? So this is the litany of saints in Hebrews chapter 11, and the reading specifically marks the faith of Abram, right? So as you're thinking about these readings, they've been arranged around this idea of faith. The thing that I would like to underscore, and perhaps even warn preachers about, is that there is a way to look at faith that simplifies the idea into maybe a feeling, right? And Genesis 15 can lend us toward that. There's this beautiful scene. It cuts off in verse 6 of chapter 15, in which Abraham is looking at the stars and his faith is being reckoned to him as righteousness. But you turn the page, and the very next chapter, in Genesis chapter 16, and remember, our Bible is preserving this story, is the story of Sarah and Abram taking their servant Hagar, their vulnerable young slave woman from Egypt, and forcefully impregnating her with what will become the first son of Abram, Ishmael. Now, that is within the scope of the story meant to be a bit of a counter to what you see in Genesis 15, right? So it seems as though Abram has a tremendous moment of faith. A covenant is forged with God, and yet in Genesis chapter 16, what we see is some working out, right, of this strange idea. They seem to be believing God that there will be an heir, but they are inflicting harm on another through their faith. And this, I want to suggest, is one of the ways that we might think about these readings, right, is that faith is a powerful idea, right? And it's not just a feeling. But in all of these passages, what we see is faith is active. And I want to point out that Psalm chapter 33 provides a very interesting counter, right? So we hear, here's what you should put your faith in Genesis chapter 15, your faith in God, right? In Hebrews chapter 11, this kind of tremendous faith of the saints, right? Luke chapter 12, Put your faith in what you cannot see, in what really matters. But in Psalm chapter 33, we hear this counter. Do not put your faith in princes. Don't put your faith in kings. Don't put your faith in great armies, in warrior strength, in war horses, right? That is a warning. In Psalm chapter 33, what we hear in the readings is we can put our faith in the wrong things, right? Throughout all of these readings, what we hear is both what we should believe in, what we should put our faith in, and what we should not, right? So these are ways that we might think about faith in these kind of complex ways that all these readings offer, right? Chapter 15 of Genesis, read alone, verses 1 through 6, cut out from the passages that surround it, make us think that faith is simply just sort of a belief, rather than what we see, which is a wrestling that's even within verses 1 through 6, right? So Abram immediately pushes back against God and says, how will I know that any of this will be true? What I want to suggest for those of you that are working through the readings for preaching this week is that what you might do is wrestle through this idea of faith as the readings present them, right? Faith is not just feelings. It is not just words or profession, right? But faith is active and it's proven by our choices, right? So this seems an important way for our congregations maybe to even think about, or maybe ourselves, right, to think about what faith is. Faith waits, right? It is in the tension between the now, the present, and the future. What is hoped for, not yet realized, right? Faith lies in a tension. It is not easy. And as we can see in the example of Abram, mistakes are sometimes made. And one thing we need to be careful of with our own faith and the way that we use our faith, many of us are in positions of power, is that it does not then cause harm to others, as we see in chapter 16. What we see is the servant Hagar, a vulnerable slave, who is now made a victim to the way that Abram and Sarah work out their faith. For me, at this moment, these readings are kind of giving me pause as I think about my own faith and how I might work that out. As I remember what Jesus says about putting my treasure in heaven rather than in the things around me, the things that are calling me from the world, about status, about position, about all that work that I need to do. Where is faith calling me? It is calling me to sit in that tension, in that discomfort, in the question that Abram brings in chapter 15. What, oh God, will you give me for I continue childless, right? The recognition of something that is unrealized in the present and something that is deeply hoped for and yearned for in this relationship with God is to believe, right? God, what will you do? How will you do this? And these questions are part of what informs our story of Abram and what makes him such a hero in Hebrews chapter 11, right? It isn't an easy faith that Abram encapsulates in his story. Abram gives us an example of complex faith that falls down on the road, that continues within doubt, and yet is steadfast in a way that we can now, thousands of years later, consider together as a congregation. And here's what I want to leave you with as you think about the readings for this week, the 9th week after Pentecost Ordinary Time. God bless you in your work, and happy summer and happy preaching.